Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni muli wanji, namaste, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedlie, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast, a special Juneteenth episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We're so happy that you are joining us in our mission to help families grow closer through reading. We have an amazing show lined up for you today. Karyn Parsons, the author of Saving the Day, Garrett Morgan's life-changing invention, and star of The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air will be joining us. Amanda Lynch, she is the author of Breathe, Baby, Breathe, and also our ancestors' wildest dreams. She'll be here. K Ibura, she'll be here. She's the author of When the World Turned Upside Down. Our friend, Super Bowl champion Malcolm Mitchell will be here. You might remember he was here celebrating my very favorite book in the whole world. And also joining us will be Dr. Michael Waters. He is the author of the soon-to-be-released Liberty Civil Rights Road Trip. He was here not too long ago to celebrate for beautiful black boys who believe in a better world. And we also have another incredible guest. We have some great interns working with us here on the Reading with Your Kids podcast. And one of those interns, the amazing Justina Thompson, came to me and she said, Juneteenth is really special to me. Can we do something on the podcast to celebrate it? And I said, sure. What's Juneteenth? Because I've heard of it, but I didn't really know what it was. So here to tell us is my amazing intern, Justina Thompson. Hey, Justina, welcome.
Hi, Jed. It's so great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now, as many of you may be aware, on June 17th of this, just a few days ago, June 17th, 2021, Juneteenth became a federal holiday. But even with that recognition, I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who really don't understand what Juneteenth is all about. Justina, can you tell us a little bit about it, please?
Of course. I'm sure a lot of people don't know, and that's okay. But historically, Juneteenth is an annual holiday that acknowledges and, of course, celebrates the end of slavery for African Americans within the United States. And actually, it's been celebrated for a really, really long time, since 1865. Juneteenth was established after the Civil War and after the Emancipation Proclamation, which everyone is familiar with. You've probably heard about it in our history textbooks. Maybe you've seen it in some documentary films. And that was passed by our 16th U.S. President, Abraham Lincoln. Juneteenth is also sometimes referred to as Independence Day or Emancipation Day.
That's really fascinating. I think a lot of people, me included, thought that the minute the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, that every person who had been held in slavery became free. But it took more time and more work and a lot more sacrifice.
Yeah, it did. Actually, our guest, Michael Waters, who will be in the episode a little bit later, he kind of shares with us how after the Emancipation Proclamation, slaves actually didn't believe that they were free, so they went to a church in Texas, and they officially did it there on holy ground, and that is when slaves believed that they were officially free.
Now, if all we wanted to do was to share with you a quick little wiki explanation about what Juneteenth was, we'd be done. But Juneteenth is a special holiday, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So we decided to ask a number of our friends to come in and share their feelings with us. One of the first friends we asked was Amanda Lynch. You may remember Amanda's been on the show a number of times, first to celebrate her Breathe, Baby, Breathe mindfulness series for really young kids. And then we had a really fun time speaking with Amanda and her daughter, Ava Holloway, about the beautiful and inspiring picture book that they co-authored, My Ancestors' Wildest Dreams. Here's our friend, Amanda Lynch.
When I think about what Juneteenth means to me, I'm drawn to images and stories about my granny's grandmother, Mary Jane Harris Palmer, who lived enslaved on the Palmer Plantation in Powhatan, Virginia, which is just about 20 minutes outside of our state capital of Richmond. Mary Jane lived there with her husband and children but she also bore many children by the plantation owner's son, M.B. Palmer. I am one of his descendants. I think about the heartache, the desperation, the hope, and the resilience that must have filled Mary Jane the many times she tried to escape. The desperation that must have been in existence for her even after the end of the Civil War, in recognizing and realizing that opportunities simply weren't there for her to be free. Juneteenth isn't just a federal holiday. It represents the freedom, the struggles, and the resilience of those of us whose ancestors toiled day in and day out to build this nation.
Thank you, Amanda, for sharing those very powerful and very personal thoughts. Right now, we also asked K Ibura her thoughts. Kay is the author of When the World Turned Upside Down. Kay?
When I think of Juneteenth, I think of two things: celebration and resilience. It's a celebration of the Africans who survived displacement, survived the brutal landscape of slavery, and as they were surviving, they were also holding on to their culture, identity, humanity, practices, communal relationships, and created this rich, rich core from which Black Americans sprung. I can just imagine what it felt like to hear that news that enslavement had ended. It had to be an eruption of joy. And that eruption of joy is still a hallmark of Black culture today. It's what we use to hold on as we're moving through our own horrific landscapes, which are less brutal in scope, but in terms of the present moment, are extremely limiting and extremely violent. I can't think about Juneteenth, this moment of Black celebration for Black freedom, without thinking about Frederick Douglass. And he wrote this speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." And in it, he asks if the political freedoms and the justice embodied in the Declaration of Independence are extended to us, or extended to Black people. We're still asking those questions today. It is a contemporary question rooted in the people that we celebrate when we celebrate Juneteenth. It is a unique experience to have this level of echo across time, where we all had to work with this double consciousness, where we keep our humanity, we hold our humanity and hold each other in humanity, while facing this sort of brutal infringement from the outside society. So celebrating Juneteenth is celebrating ourselves, is celebrating our resilience, is celebrating in this moment. We can focus on the joy of surviving. We can focus on the joy of resilience. We can focus on the joy of being together, celebrating us for us before we step back out into the larger world and face those slings and arrows again.
Thank you for sharing that, Kay. That was beautiful. Justina, it's clear why Juneteenth would be important to folks in the African American community. But I think that Juneteenth should be celebrated and should be important to all Americans, to all people. Do you agree, and why?
Well, in my opinion, especially within recent times and with all of the contemporary events, current events that have been happening, I think that Juneteenth is still an important holiday in today's society because the fight for freedom in the Black community hasn't really ended, though slavery has been outlawed. Obviously, African Americans are still under attack and they're still targeted systemically. And I think until that stops, as a community, not just Black people, but I think Americans and anyone else who is, supportive of Black people should persist and resist and continue to advocate for the right to equality and the right to respect and to be treated properly. And I think it's incredibly necessary to celebrate Juneteenth to not only acknowledge our struggles, but to also continuously uplift our accomplishments and joy as a collective community. And Juneteenth, I think as a holiday, when we do that, empowers us and it highlights our successes. And it's going to continue to be a reminder that our mutual history connects all of us.
I agree, Justina. And as you're speaking, I'm reminded of what Amanda Gorman said the day of President Biden's inauguration. Our country, it's not broken. It's simply unfinished. And coming together to celebrate Juneteenth and what that means is one way that we can work towards finishing the promise that the United States is all about. Speaking of unfinished, we're not finished with this special episode. You had a really wonderful conversation with Karyn Parsons. That was your very first interview. What did that feel like?
Wow, Jed. Interviewing Karyn was such an enlightening and pleasant experience. She was such a great person to have on the show, and I really enjoyed talking to her. She had so many amazing thoughts about her project, Sweet Blackberry, which we will discuss in another episode, but her thoughts on Juneteenth were really, really grounding, and we shared a lot of similar perspectives. She talked about what it's like to kind of talk about the Black experience with other people and how to navigate that now that we're in a society where African American lives are kind of seen as something that are so much more important. And it was just really great to sit down with her and kind of bounce ideas off of each other. She was such an amazing person to interview, and I really enjoyed talking with her. And I hope that everyone listening also enjoys hearing our interview, because I loved doing it.
And right now, here are Karyn Parsons and Justina Thompson.
So speaking of celebrating, Juneteenth is coming up, and we are deciding, as I previously said, to do a Juneteenth episode. And I just kind of wanted to briefly talk about Juneteenth. A lot of people don't really know what it is. It's kind of something that's recently gotten more traction in media outlets, unfortunately, because of the murders of people that have been happening. Yeah. I went to a Juneteenth/Black Lives Matter protest last year around the time George Floyd got murdered, and I think that we should just continue to talk about Juneteenth and try to associate it with more positive festivities and more positive thoughts. So it's an annual holiday, and it's only observed, in certain places. I think it's observed in 47 states and not all 50. Which is a little weird. But I kind of just wanted to talk about Juneteenth, and is there anything that you do specifically to celebrate the holiday?
I think that, to me, it's the same. It's not the same, but it's a barbecue holiday for me.
Yeah, it is.
It's like the 4th of July. Okay, so we're celebrating, the country celebrates its independence. But I think that people, and it's American people, celebrating their independence, I think is their freedom is incredibly important. And I really think that it's important. I cannot say how strongly I feel it's important for all Americans to be celebrating this together. This is something that happened for all of us, right? And unfortunately, there's so much divisiveness in this country that continues, and I feel like we're not going to heal if we don't take on these things together. It's not just a black fight. And I think it's treated that way a lot. And I think some white people aren't interested in the fight, but I think far more people don't know if it's okay for them to be involved in the fight, or what they can do, or if they should be a part. And I think we need to make it clear that, no, we're Americans. This is something that happened. Slavery was something here. The slavery we're talking about is the slavery that happened here on American soil. And so once that was abolished, that was a tremendous thing for the country. So that's for all people to celebrate. We should all be celebrating that together. And if we can do that, it helps us move forward. If it's just black people that are celebrating it, what does that say? What does that mean? So I think that's really important that we encourage people to look at that. It's the same like with Black History Month, where people are like, oh, Black History Month, and a lot of people go, well, that's for black people. I'm not really I'm not invited to the party. No, you're invited to the party because it's American history, and eventually we'll be able to push the Black History Month thing away as we absorb, and we recognize that Black history is American history, and we're teaching it as often. All of these stories and stories that have been deliberately kept out of the books, the textbooks, as we bring these things back in. we can recognize this is for all of us. We're all Americans here, so we should all be celebrating together. So I'm going to be having a barbecue. We are here at the house going to be having a barbecue. I think we've done it a couple times before. It doesn't always work out schedule-wise. It will work out this year. And I think with all the same vigor and excitement of the 4th of July, which has become just this, big, illustrious barbecue celebration time, I think we have to do that with Juneteenth. We have to push. I know it's just recent years that people have become even familiar with what it is, but we have to start more and more celebration of it, so that becomes normalized, that we celebrate this day. This is a day of celebration. We want to make that the regular thing.
Have you had any experiences that have kind of made you realize that as well? Like, it's important for me to know about your culture and your heritage, and kind of share that with other people, or share resources that talk about that?
I think it's really, I think it's great that you're saying you're willing to share resources. And it's funny, my daughter and I were, just before I got on here, my daughter and I were just talking about the feeling that a lot of people have of Black people. We were also talking about the trans community, and feeling like you have to explain to people, and it gets exhausting. But the thing is, people, I read something that somebody wrote saying how exhausting it is for them as a trans person to have to explain their identity and where they're coming from with people all of the time. And one of the largest showings of love that they receive is when somebody who's not trans does that explaining to somebody else. And I often talk about how it's so great when I know that a lot of people who are not Black feel like they want to be quiet, they want to step back, and it's important to listen, but it is also important to advocate for people, and to if you have the information and you do understand, to step up and speak up, because that is such a showing of love and understanding for your whole community, for everybody. And so I do think it's really important it gets exhausting for Black people to talk about, to explain certain things all the time. And hopefully our allies can step in sometimes and go, I got this. I think I understand, and share with other people. And we should encourage that, not discourage that. There's a line between saying, I need you to listen right now, and don't say anything. You don't talk about this. We're all, like I said before, this is for all of us to heal and get better. And so we need it to be as important. It can't just be important to Black people. These things have to be important to everybody. But I do think when we can share, like you said, resources and go, hey, here's some ways you can learn more about this. We should give that when we can, when we have it in us to do it, because we want people to learn. But I don't think it should always be expected that people are just tireless and, yeah.
My last question kind of segues into that. How can we share more about African American heritage with our children, and kind of at the same time prepare them to go out into the world and then share that information with other people and what they've learned? What have you learned from Sweet Blackberry, and also writing your children's books and writing your scripts for your films about those ways?
To tell the story, to bring the stories to people?
Yes.
I think the thing is just, I think just educating ourselves, looking further, looking deeper, finding stories, and then just passing it on. So many things have been left deliberately out of our history books, right? I was also very naive for a long time. I would say, oh, these things are being lost. These things are being lost. They're not being lost. They're being hidden. They're being buried. And, I didn't want to say that. I didn't want to think that. And so I think it's very important that we all be vigilant when we discover these stories. And we have this social media, which can be such a drag in so many ways and such a blessing in so many others. And one place that it can be really a great tool is to share, to pass it on. Oh, wow, I heard about this incredible person. Pass it on. I heard about, so then forget this, these textbooks. They get nothing on all of us, right? We can share these stories. That's what I want to do with Sweet Blackberry. I was discovering stories. My mother was introducing me to things, and I was finding more and more. And I want kids to know these people. I want them to know about these triumphs. I want them to be excited and look at these obstacles that come along as opportunities for greatness. So that was the whole idea. And so I think if we can all, when we find stuff, whether we look intentionally or we just trip over something amazing, pass it on. Make sure you don't just hold it in yourself, that you do what you can to just tell somebody, I read the really cool story today. They're just, however, let's just put it out there.
Yes, of course. And also knowledge is power. And like you said, opportunities for greatness. Once you've acquired knowledge, that is an immediate gateway for an opportunity for greatness.
Yes.
And so I think that we should just encourage that and promote that and pass, as you said, pass that along as much as we can.
I agree.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us, Karyn. This was such a fruitful conversation.
Oh, you were wonderful, Justina. This was a pleasure. Thank you.
You'll be able to hear Justina's entire conversation with Karyn Parsons in the very, very near future. That's why we would love for you to go to our website, readingwithyourkids.com, and subscribe to our free newsletter so you don't miss a thing. Right now, I want to welcome my friend, Malcolm Mitchell, Super Bowl champion Malcolm Mitchell. He was on the podcast in January of 2021, celebrating World Read Aloud Day. What a powerful story Malcolm tells. He is the author of my very favorite book in the world, and he is one of my very favorite literacy advocates in the whole wide world. Malcolm Mitchell.
What does Juneteenth mean to me? My name is Malcolm Mitchell, Super Bowl champion and author. And ironically enough, my son was born on June 19th, 2020. We call him a Juneteenth baby. So, what Juneteenth means to me is new opportunity, new life, new perspective, freedom, the ability to change the direction in which you are taking in life, or the direction you are forced to head through life. I think Juneteenth is a great opportunity for my culture, African American culture, to pause and think deeply about the people who've come before them, the sacrifice that they've made to give us the freedom to have a choice, to honor that choice, not by forcefully doing anything, but by pausing and thinking deeply about whether the choice is worth making. I appreciate this country, and I appreciate my culture in this country, and I appreciate all of my ancestors, those who have come before me in this world and a world that I don't fully know. And I just appreciate having the opportunity to speak freely and openly, nationally, globally, about what I love about my people. I appreciate Juneteenth. And I'll be celebrating my son's birthday on Juneteenth. And I hope you celebrate Juneteenth as well.
Wow. Thanks, Malcolm Mitchell. I had so much fun talking to him here on the episode, and he's such a great guy. What did you think, Justina?
I really enjoyed hearing his thoughts, Jed. I think that having the authors that we had on today's episode it's really great to hear so many diverse experiences. And I think hearing Malcolm Mitchell's, background and his thoughts were really, really good.
Yeah. Well, we're not done yet. We have your conversation with Dr. Michael Waters. Dr. Michael Waters, he was on the podcast earlier in the year to celebrate for beautiful black boys who believe in a better world. And he'll be back on again later this year to celebrate his brand new book, Liberty's Civil Rights Road Trip. What are your thoughts having interviewed Dr. Waters?
Jed, Dr. Waters was, I think, one of those people that I sat down and talked with, and that conversation was just unforgettable. He has so much knowledge about so much history. And I think the great thing about his book, which we will discuss in our interview, is that it highlights a really important part of Juneteenth, which is, civil rights history. And a lot of people don't really consider civil rights history as a part of Juneteenth because, it's kind of post-slavery, and people think that civil rights is kind of its own separate kind of history. But I do think that we kind of need to consider civil rights history as a part of Juneteenth as well. And Dr. Michael Waters really, really, shares his perspectives on how important it is for children to interact with those spaces and interact with that history. And just sitting down and talking with him about that, especially as someone who has grown up without much, resources about Juneteenth and civil rights history, it was really, really, really enriching. And I loved sitting down and talking with him and hearing all of his amazing words.
Right now, please welcome Dr. Michael Waters.
The first thing that I'd like to ask you is, to what extent have you had the opportunity to kind of learn about Juneteenth? And was that something that you celebrated as a child, or is it something that you learned about in schools when you were growing up?
I'm a native Texan. My family's been in Texas for generations. And so Juneteenth has always been a part of our celebrations and remembrances. I can't remember a time where Juneteenth wasn't a big deal for us. But I will say that as I've grown, my understanding of Juneteenth and connection to that history has grown as well over the years. I grew up, came of age in the Houston area, and just south of Houston in Galveston is where the Emancipation Proclamation was in fact read, letting those enslaved persons know that they were free. Not everyone knows the story, but initially that proclamation was read in one location, but it was such an amazing story that the enslaved persons requested that it be read at a church, because they thought if it was read on the grounds of a church, then it would actually be real. And so there was a second reading of the Emancipation Proclamation on the grounds of Leedy Chapel, AME Church in Galveston. And it's from there that these enslaved persons knew, in fact, that yes, we are free. Literally the day after I was married, my wife and I were married, we were to take a cruise out of Galveston, but it didn't leave until Monday afternoon. So we flew in on the Sunday morning, and that Sunday morning I had the opportunity to preach at Leedy Chapel, AME Church. And that's something that I always remember and carry with me, that I had the opportunity to preach in such a very historic and monumental place, coinciding with our marriage. But yes, Juneteenth is celebrated in very amazing ways, not just the history, not just the drumming circles, but there's always almost a family reunion atmosphere related to Juneteenth, which is beautiful. I would say that I think, though, the most impactful Juneteenth that I've ever experienced happened a few days after the unfortunate massacre that took place at Mother Emanuel AME Church in South Carolina. I was in Portland, Oregon at the time that news broke, and flew back the next day. And at the time, I was the chair of the Martin Luther King Jr. Center here in Dallas. And we planned a memorial in recognition of that great tragedy on Juneteenth. And I'll never forget standing there with our Muslim brothers and sisters, our Jewish, fellow Christian activists all together, lamenting this great tragedy and putting in the context of not just our history, but at the time, the Islamophobic harm that was happening within our community. These armed terrorists, in my opinion, who were terrorizing Muslim worshipers as they were attempting to go to their mosque in Texas. I'll never forget that Juneteenth, not just because of the heaviness of the history that surrounded it, but I'll also never forget it because we had a guest that was there with us, which was Homeland Security. And the reason Homeland Security was there is because there were persons who had actually threatened to harm those who had come to this memorial. So I held that and continue to hold that in tension, this idea that on a day in which we celebrate freedom, there is still the question of, are we actually fully free? And that's a Juneteenth that continues to inform my work and commitment to the history of Juneteenth today.
Yeah, I also think it's important to realize that Juneteenth is, yes, a holiday that is for celebrating and that is for joy, and we should continue to always embrace that. But we also need to recognize the things that have happened and also how we can learn from those experiences as a community. And Juneteenth is also a day for healing. It's a day for love, and it's a day for the expression of that love as a community. And so I think that having that goal in mind is incredibly important. I guess my next question, that can lead me into my next question. I can name a few experiences that just kind of made me realize how important it is for me to know everything about my culture and about my heritage, especially about my African American heritage. And I just want to ask you, have you had any experiences that have made you realize that as well?
You know, I'm always drawn to learning more about history, about the history of our people. That's almost a constant drive. And again, I've been afforded the opportunity to be in some very special places and to learn that history firsthand. What I have really been impacted is the times I'm able to allow this larger history of our people's experience with my family's history. I think that's where those intersections have made it most powerful. For instance, I have been in a slave warehouse in Selma. Selma at one point was the third richest city in America. A lot of people don't know that, but it was the third richest city in America, largely because of the slave trade and the goods that would come through Selma. And on one journey to Selma, the group that I was leading, myself, we were stuffed into a room, about 30 of us, and we were cramped in that room. And once we were in that room, we were informed that upwards to 100 or more persons would usually be cramped into that dark room, having been carried over the waterways, down the Alabama River, marched up the embankment, and placed again in this room, holding room, warehouse, before being sold at the foot of what is now the Edmund Pettus Bridge. That was a very transformational moment for me because it brought home the dehumanization. It brought home the fear and terror that so many of our forebears experienced, that I think in many ways is unresolved even today. But even in that space, I was taught something that made me very hopeful, that in that space, cramped all in there together, our ancestors would say to each other, "I see your greatness," in their own native tongue. What a powerful encouragement to offer to someone else in the most inhumane of spaces, to be able to say, I want to affirm and celebrate your full humanity. And I'm going to say to you, even if we are ensnarled in a system that does not, that your life really matters. Those are experiences that I've had that I seek to share with others that have been transformational for me, and that experience was brought even further home once my mother, who is a family historian, came into the recognition that a portion of our family came into Texas from that area in Alabama. That it was very possible that I was literally standing in the room where my ancestors, direct ancestors, had stood before. And what a beautiful thing in some regards, that they didn't know then in that room as enslaved persons, that generations later they would have a descendant who would stand there as one made free. Again, I think there's an arc of hope in our history, even despite the pains of our history, if we lean into it. And again, those spaces and places where that history has intersected with our family history has been particularly transformational.
That's incredibly amazing. You mentioned acknowledging greatness, and I think that it is so important that we encourage children, regardless of whether they're our kids or other children that we know, to acknowledge their greatness. And so in what ways can we share more about acknowledge the greatness that has come for them, but they can also learn how to talk about that greatness and share that greatness with others?
Well, I tell you what, I know that young people love being involved. They love doing things. And there's such a beautiful opportunity for them to be involved in the work to make Juneteenth a national holiday. Mrs. Opal Lee from Fort Worth, Texas, actually grew up with my grandmother, who's now 93. Naomi, then Forbes, now Naomi Forbes Williams. They grew up together at Baker Chapel AME Church. And my grandmother was also very active in the movement, along with my grandfather, doing marches with Thurgood Marshall. Right? So one of the things that they can do is be a part of the work for change today, to make this a national holiday, to make a holiday within a nation that unfortunately was built on the back of chattel slavery, have an actual federal holiday that can acknowledge not only that painful history, but more important, that call and press towards freedom. And so that's something that's happening right now. And I think that children can learn and participate. They can learn about what Juneteenth is, and then they can be invited to participate in making it a federal holiday. I think, there are great opportunities, as we continue to become more vaccinated, which is so important, I believe, now, and it's safer for us to journey about. There are opportunities even in a lot of local spaces to learn more of that history. Right here in the city of Dallas, we have Freedman Cemetery, a place where formerly enslaved persons are buried. That's a place that you can journey with your children to help unpack that history. There are portions of my city, the city of Dallas, that actually was plantation property and land. There's an opportunity to talk about the fact that we walk and abide in spaces and places where our ancestors were in bonds, but then talk about all of the sacrifices, not just in the Civil War, but through abolition of the Underground Railroad, such dynamic figures as Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass, to introduce them to these amazing people and their amazing work to help bring us out of that very challenging period. I see Juneteenth as a day not just for enjoyment. I do believe Black love is a form of resistance. So I'm all for Black people enjoying each other's company in Black spaces. I think that is affirming. I think that is beautiful. I think that that's as important as anything else we might do. But I also think in those spaces and places of affirming Black humanity in all of its expressions and forms, I think we have an opportunity to also have some teaching and allow the children to learn. And frankly, not just the children learn. I think there's some things that adults can learn as well.
Wow, Justina, Dr. Michael gave us a lot to think about. All of our guests gave us a lot to think about, and I've had such a wonderful time with you. I'm wondering, Justina, how are you going to celebrate Juneteenth?
Oh boy, how will I be celebrating Juneteenth? Well, my mom, she has a membership to the African American Museum in Philadelphia, and she's been talking about going for a very, very long time. And of course, we haven't been able to do that because of COVID. Things have obviously been under so many limited restrictions. But now that things are opening back up, at least here in New Jersey and in Philadelphia, we will be able to go. And so I believe that's what I'll be doing. How about you, Jed?
I think I am going to invite some family and friends over and have a cookout.
Awesome. That's the right way to do it. You have to have a cookout.
Absolutely. Hey, Justina, this has been a really fantastic episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. I really appreciate you coming and helping put this together. I think it's been really informative for a lot of people. It's certainly been informative for me.
I know. Thank you so much for allowing me to have this opportunity. I do think that Juneteenth needs to be talked about more, especially with platforms like this. I grew up not really having too much knowledge about Juneteenth, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners can resonate with having that limited encounter with Juneteenth and its history. So I'm so grateful that I was able to share this information with our listeners.
I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, I want to start by thanking our guests. Amanda Lynch, K Ibura, Malcolm Mitchell, Karyn Parsons, Dr. Michael Waters. I also want to thank my incredible team. Of course, my co-host, Justina Thompson, Alejandra Doherty, Fatima Khan, Helen Frazier. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. We'll be looking for the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.